Let's carry on now. We're still in chapter 1 of Griffin's work on human rights. Human rights, the incomplete idea is our chapter title, and we're now in section 1.2, the indeterminateness of the term HR, human rights. So let's look at a little bit more at this indeterminateness. He thinks it comes in degrees, so that's important to keep in mind. So indeterminateness is not an all or nothing affair. If you think of certain concepts like in mathematics, those tend to be extremely determinate concepts. And by that, I mean that their intention is very clearly laid out and their extension is extremely well determined. And so something either, any example either, any sort of instance is either an example of that concept or falls under that concept or is contained within the extension of that concept or not. In other words, a mathematical concept is very determinate that it does not have borderline cases. Now, yes, there is a branch of mathematics, sometimes called fuzzy logic. We're not going to look at that. But, you don't have any troubles identifying, what a triangle is, right? It's clearly laid out that it is a three-sided figure. And there's no, if you bring other sided, a four-sided figure, that's clearly not a triangle. And there's no borderline. Well, that's sort of a triangle. No, it's a three-sided, it's a closed figure. Like if I unpack the intention fully, it's very clear when something is or is not a triangle. And you might say, well, wait a second, what about when you draw triangles on flat surfaces versus triangles on basketballs? Don't some of the properties change? Yes, they do. There's no question there that you would have to take into account the larger context. But even within the context of where you're defining those concepts, like the concept of drawing triangles on flat surfaces, like in Euclidean geometry, that would all be very clear for that. And if you said looking at surfaces of like positive curvature, like basketballs, the triangles that you draw on that would all be very clear as well and distinguishable from other figures that you could draw on basketballs. But the main point is that in mathematics, the concepts are basically determinate. Most of our concepts that we use in everyday life are not like that. They're kind of fuzzy, and some of them are super fuzzy. And in other words, they just have fuzzy boundaries. That's all I mean. It doesn't mean they're useless. I mean, the great thinker and theologian St. Augustine, said, I know what time is. Not I know what the time is. I know what time is. Just don't ask me to define it. And I think we're all mostly like that. If I ask you, do you understand the word time? And you might say, well, what do you mean? I'd say, can you use it properly in a sentence? Do you understand how the word time works? Yeah, you have an understanding of it. But would you be able to give its perfect intention? No. You might be able to give a rough one, but there might be some cases where you're not sure if we're talking about time or not. So it has a fuzzy boundary in ordinary language. So lots of that. Here's another one. Even an ordinary concept, just a boring old concept like chair. Very useful because you always want to know if there's a chair left. Is there a chair left for me at supper? So in that sense, it's very determinate. It's quite easily. But, if you have a large family, sometimes you start improvising, right? Pull up a chair. There's no more chairs left. Okay, go grab the piano bench. That's good enough. Is a piano bench a chair? Well, it certainly is functioning like a chair. Wait a second. What does a chair even mean? So this is a little exercise just to get you thinking that chair will have its meaning or its intention. Okay, we've looked at that. It will have its extension, which is a subset of the world. In other words, a chair you could think of through its intention and its meaning, it divides the world into two sets, right? The world of not chairs, like this. This isn't a chair. This isn't a chair. My hand isn't a chair. So it divides the world into two very unequal size set, namely all the not chairs, which is like all the stuff you're looking at here, and the world of, or the subset of the world of chairs. But then there will be those borderline cases. So the indeterminates would be like, is a piano bench a chair? Like is like a beanbag chair? I mean, what's that thing? It's a ball. I mean, but you sit on it. and then you sink into it or something like that. Is it a chair? Well, maybe. Does a chair have to have legs? So in that sense, like maybe. Or when you go camping and you sit on a log or something, and you're sitting around with other people around a campfire, and they're sitting in lawn chairs, and you're sitting on a log. Is that log a chair? Well, it's functioning like one. So then you can see that these attempts to try and unpack an intention an intention extremely clearly can be a bit muddy, but we don't have any problems using the concept of chair. And just as a little sort of a leap head is most concepts that we use again tend to be like that. And if you this fuzziness, and so but we don't have any problems with it. It's only when we start thinking about it, as Augustine said, like, don't ask me to define chair, but yeah, I can run around pointing them out. Children learn how to point out chairs quite early, and they don't have any problems with it. But if you ask the child to define one, they'd be probably quite puzzled what you're talking about. They'd probably just point out examples, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to get to know a concept, examples are helpful. Okay, so there's an indeterminacy, but Griffin is saying there's a different indeterminacy here than that of the term human rights, and he thinks human rights is even even worse. That human rights is more indeterminate than remember indeterminacy comes in degrees. So human rights is more indeterminate than regular old concepts like chair. He thinks that it's even more indeterminate, worse off, right? It's not, HR is not just worse than chair, it's worse than other concepts like justice or being courageous. We're better at agreeing on how to apply, justice with Griffin things. You might want to quibble with him, but he's trying to make the point that human rights, the term, has a specific and sort of egregious kind of indeterminateness that's worse than everyday words like chair, more complex terms like time, and ethical terms like justice and courage. So we can rationally argue, right, about things like chair, about concepts like chair, courageous, and justice. Why? Because there's some kind of shared criteria. If you can argue, and I mean argue, not just scream at each other, but have a rational discussion where people put out a proposal and you maybe modify and put a counter proposal. Like that's what I mean by arguing, not just yelling. If you could do that with someone, there's a lot of agreement, right? It's when you have no agreement. It's very hard to argue with someone when you have absolutely no agreement, because it's like, I don't even know where to start. If I want to argue about what a chair is, we at least have to have quite a bit of shared criteria. Like, we'd have to have the concept of sitting down. We'd have to have the concept, like lots of shared concepts would have to go into it before we could even discuss the specific concept of chair. So there's lots of agreement required in order to argue about a concept. And of course we would be able to argue, like, you might be in the log is a chair, the piano bench is a chair. And let's say I thought, well, not really. You might give me some kind of story as to why I should say that a piano bench is a chair. And I might not agree with you, but I would understand you and we could argue about it. We're not really deeply puzzled about these concepts, even though they are indeterminate. They can be fuzzy. But Griffin's point is that there's this shared criteria. And for lots of other moral terms, he's pounding away that human rights doesn't even have this sort of shared context. He thinks that it's not something that we can really argue about because we don't really have a good intention for it. Right, intention, the meaning of it. And so we can't even really, not only do we lack the criteria, we don't even know what a good criteria would be. And he gives a couple examples. Well, it's not the case now, but of course, China used to have a one-child policy. The UN Declaration on Human Rights says that, it's a human right to determine how many children you have. And he says, well, is that a violation of it? If you say, if a state says, oh, you can only have one kid, what if the state said, or you can only have 3, which I think is now the case in China. But the point is, it doesn't matter what any particular state does. Is if a state not particular, but if a state puts any restriction on the number of kids to have, or wants you to have, or encourage, is that a violation of a human right? And if we're puzzled about whether or not it is, what would be a good argument? Like, do we even agree on what are the grounds of a good argument? So the indeterminacy is not simply not being sure when a case for a human right is there or a violation thereof. But so we're not sure what exactly to say. We're not even sure how to argue. We're not even sure as to what would count as a good argument. There's lots of concepts that do have this as well. You know, think about some kinds of religious concepts like the existence of God. You know, many people may even disagree on what counts as a good argument for the existence of God. So it's not that human rights is the only one that has this problem of shared criteria, or, you know, not even sure of what the criteria would be for a good argument. But it's definitely an important one, because human rights is an important concept. Griffin is always reiterating that he thinks it's a very important concept, and we'll see later, you can't jettison it. You got to keep it. We're stuck with it, and it's actually a very helpful concept at that. So how would we again? You know, if you have a human right over your body, that's often used in lots of pro-choice arguments, and fine. How strong is that? If the government prohibits selling body parts, is that a violation of a human right? So that's kind of a weird one, right? You know, like, you think if you have what exactly is this sort of notion of a sovereignty over a body when you look at it in other contexts? And what would even be, Griffin says, what would count as a good argument? Either saying, yeah, that's a violation of a human right, or no, it isn't. That's not a violation of a human right. If the government says no, sovereignty of the body doesn't include selling its parts. Okay, so what would be what would be the criteria for a good argument here? So think now. You know, I put this term art up. You know, we previously we agreed. He says, Griffin says, in history, we agreed on the extension of human rights. Right? I'm pulling up ones that, you know, making it more problematic, because the lack of the intention is making things more problematic. When people agree on the extension, you know, the intention doesn't matter as much. And that might sound a little more mysterious, but if you think about it, Griffin says that the agreement on the extension, historical, right? Not today, but historically, the extension really was in the domain of civil and political rights. So human rights were in that case, in those two cases. So same thing, I'm going to say with the notion of art. Think of this as an example to help maybe clarify some of the notion of indeterminateness with human rights and why it's a problem. I'm just going to tell this sort of a breezy little story. Like, think about this. About 150 years ago, probably the average person on the street did not have in his or her head a good definition of art. So the meaning of art, the intention, might have been just as thin or as unknown, right? As today, most people walking around don't think about art like that. They might like it, but they don't have a good intention of it. So if you say, what do you mean by art? They wouldn't be able to give you a good unpacking, you know, like wouldn't be able to give you the meaning or the intention. But maybe 150 years ago, there wouldn't have been much disagreement on the extension of the term art. And what, to make that a little clearer, it would be when the average person who doesn't know much about art would have walked in to a museum, an art gallery, and looked at all the paintings, would have said, oh yeah, that's art. There's nothing in here that surprises me. But it's still, I could say, well, how do you define it? What's going on here? I don't know. But it's all art, that's for sure. And the museum and the art curators will go, oh, thank you. We all agree this is art. And very few could really say why or whatever. But they all agree that what's in front of them, namely the objects in front of them, they're art. So the extension is agreed on. Like, yeah, this looks great, and have a nice day, and see you at the next exhibit. Okay, now let's jump to the present. Many people, again, who don't have much of an understanding of art, don't care about it, but they could like it, would walk into an art gallery and look at some paintings and go, I don't get this at all. Is that art? I don't think that's art. And of course, we all know there's lots of people who go into art galleries and say, that's not art. I don't know what that is. It's splashy stuff on a canvas or something. That's not art. And if you say, what is art? I don't know, but that's not it. So my point is not whether anyone's right or wrong. My point is that there would be lots of people who would go in to the place of extension of art, namely the physical instantiation of art, the objects of art, and today be very shocked and not like, I don't recognize any of this stuff. And, I don't agree with the curators. So in that sense, it wasn't so problematic when everybody agreed on the extension, even though the intention was very unclear. So art wasn't really problematic in that sense when the extension was clear, even if the intention was unclear. Now we're in a total game where even the extension of art, like some of the stuff that you might see, you might scratch your head. I can't figure out how that made it into the art gallery. So it's not always problematic. But why don't we just give a definition then? Why don't we just give a definition, a bunch of words synonymous with the term HR, or a list of essential features, and we'll just define human rights and be done with it. And well, we could do that, but Griffin just says no. Some people have tried it, right? So you can look those up in the footnotes. Griffin thinks that fails. Why does he say no? He thinks that you really should be following the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein on the notion of a family resemblance to define a concept. That sounds much more mysterious than it is. Family resemblance. You ever gone to and looked at a family, an album of pictures of a given family, and you notice when you look at all the faces, for instance, there might not be a single property that everyone has, but you notice that, oh yeah, there's Uncle Ned's nose, and a chunk of people have that. Then there's Aunt Sally's ears or something, and another chunk, but there's no single property that unites the whole set. But the properties overlap. So somebody who has Uncle Ned's nose has Aunt Sally's ears. And that links the Uncle Ned nose people with the Aunt Sally ear people. And you have this overlapping set. But there's no single invariant property that runs through the whole set. But you just kind of look and you go, yeah, everybody in this sort of looks the same, but they look the same in different ways. So that's how a family is often defined. There's no single set of property, or even really a set of clear properties. And so that's where he's kind of going in the direction that human rights is more like a family resemblance concept. That's jumping ahead a bit, but that's what's going on in that one footnote. But at the end of it all, he says, we really need to get a better intention and to resolve this indeterminacy. So how are we going to do that? We'll check that out in the next video.